Hello to the chess chicos and the chess chicas. Today we are going to do a video that is a little bit outside my general scope of action, but I thought that this was actually a cool idea, requested by the way by a fan, and that request was to make a tier list video for the different Sicilian main lines, and I thought, that's actually pretty cool. So let's do that. Well, luckily, we have got a tier list already made up for us. Now, in order to avoid the clumsiness on my end when I'm switching between this and the chessboard, I had to cut off the tail end of things. You are not going to see about 2 variations, but don't worry, when I put them up on the list, it's gonna show. So, what I'm going to do, we're going to go through one by one. I'm going to explain the pros and the cons of each line, and then we are going to put it on the list, and then everyone can get very upset and argumentative in the very end. So without further ado, let's begin with the Kan variation, demonstrated here by fellow Australian Molten Lee. So the Kan is basically also known as the Paulsen variation, which goes with e6, takes, and then a6. The most important thing that you need to know about this variation of the Sicilian is that it shows quite a bit of similarities to the Scheveningen, where we play knight f6, knight c3, and d6, in that the pawns almost always end up on e6 and d6. However, because we have omitted knight f6, knight c3, the Kan allows white to enter the Maróczy bind. So if you are taking on this opening with black, you need to be very, very well versed against the knight c3 variations, which tend to branch out really, really widely. Also, you need to know the classical Maróczy bind, which by the way also occurs in English move orders here with bishop e2 and then bishop e3. And last but not least, there is also the bishop d3 variation here, which also tends to lead to Maróczy bind setups like so. So with that in mind, what are the good things about the Kan? The Kan is very flexible in that we don't commit to anything too soon, especially with the knights. So the black b8 knight can often go to c6, but it very often goes to d7. b5 is very early introduced by the early a6 move, which means that we get access to bishop b7 early on. Overall flexibility and fluid pawn structure is what is good about the Kan. The downside is that you need to know a wide range of structures, in particular the Maróczy bind, but also Scheveningen setups, to feel safe, but also to feel like you understand what you are playing. So I definitely would not recommend this variation as an introduction into Sicilian. So if you pick up the Sicilian, this I would not go to as my first chosen line, because in many cases, for you to play this opening well, you need to have previous or already pre-existing knowledge of different other Sicilian structures. So for this reason, I'm definitely not going to put it in God tier, but I also don't really see why I should put it only respectable, because the line is pretty good. It should be sitting somewhere between champion and respectable. For the time being, I'm going to go down here, but I think I will change my mind and I will go up one. The next variation is going to be the Taimanov. Now, the Taimanov is also, and here the naming is quite funny, it is also known as the Paulsen, and now we see the continuity of opening theory. So first, this idea came to the fore with e6, which was known as the Paulsen, right? And then black players later figured out that if we omit knight c6, that makes the structure far more flexible, and hence the Neo-Paulsen, also known as the Kan, was born. So what's cooking with the Paulsen? And at this point, by the way, I would like to quickly make a additional comment that I'm never going to address the anti-Sicilians in this video, so I'm purely focusing on the open Sicilian aspect, because obviously if you play knight c6, that may impact, you know, what you play against the Alapin, yada yada yada. I'm not going there now, so it's only gonna be open Sicilian. So the starting position of the Alapin looks like this, and very often it continues with a6, although sometimes players play first queen c7, floating e6, a6 and so on, but generally speaking what we are looking at is this kind of setup. Just like with the Kan, here too the game tends to transition very often into Scheveningen structures, and so knowing the Paulsen or the Taimanov means that you need to have some ideas about Scheveningen structures where the pawn is on d6. It has evolved immensely in terms of opening theory, because one of the biggest advantages of the Taimanov used to be, or that was the consideration, that the ever so popular English attack was not playable against it because of the bishop b4, knight f6 pin and then early d5 lines. However, opening theory has overturned this evaluation, and it turns out that actually these variations are quite playable, in fact, from White's perspective, which has added a huge amount of extra layer to the theory of the Taimanov. There is an immense jungle of lines here too. In the 95 lines, Magnus Carlsen has scored some spectacular victories with White, but he played it also with Black. And then there are the transitions or transpositions, for example, with bishop e2, knight f6, and then bishop e3 or castles first. These variations are also massive, and here Black often transposes into Scheveningen instead of playing bishop b4. Long story short, I don't want to get lost in the many theoretical discussions. If you want to play the Paulsen, you really need to know, again, a wide range of Sicilian structures, such as the Scheveningen, and those unique to the Paulsen. One of them would be, by the way, take. It's very rare that White takes on c6 in mainline Sicilians. The Paulsen is one where it happens, or Taimanov, quite frequently, and so you also need to be very familiar with this particular structure. Overall, my judgment is the same. It is a very sound, great opening, brilliant line if you would like to win games with Black, but it is another one that I would not recommend as your entry-level Sicilian. And for this reason, we are going to put this guy right next to the Kan. They are very closely related too, so they should take up the same evaluation. Once again, I would love to put them halfway through, but I cannot do that. Next up on the list is going to be an easier one to deal with. That is none other than the O'Kelly variation, which is e4, c5, knight f3, and a6. Now, this variation has always had the reputation of an okay-ish sideline, so to speak, rather than the trendy main Sicilians. I don't think that it's particularly bad, but it's very tunnel visiony. The positions that you get out of it are quite, I didn't want to use the word boring, but they always appear to be the same type of story. So two things. After c3, you are basically playing a slightly inferior Alapin Sicilian, because we played a6, which is not useful in every single scenario in the Alapin Sicilian. Additionally to that, White can also play c4 and play a hedgehog structure, so Black needs to know that stuff too. And of course, the main idea of the O'Kelly is that this early d4 takes and knight takes line is really not that great a response, because knight f6, knight c3, and e5 is known to be very good for Black when knight b5 is no longer playable, hence a6 the point. And if knight f5, then of course comes d5, undermining the f5 knight. This is the main trick idea behind the O'Kelly. But once again, if White either plays c3 here or c4, then Black definitely has a fair bit to prove as such. I would put the O'Kelly By the way, the just tricks category is something that I think I will altogether avoid. It's a surprise weapon. Every now and then you can chuck it in. I think it's not necessarily a terrible thing to do. I definitely wouldn't have the Okeli as my main Sicilian if I were black, right? So I would learn something far more complex and satisfying, whether it be the Kan or the Najdorf or the Dragon or whatever, and keep the Okeli as a side weapon that I occasionally throw in when, you know, it is not expected. Classical. Alright, so the name already suggests that we are looking to do something really, really cool. The classical Sicilian is basically kicking off from this position. And here, of course, the most popular line is the Richter Rouser with bishop g5. There is the Sozin attack with bishop c4. There is bishop e2 here. Bishop e3 is not that great of a line. And there are a few other side variations, but these are roughly the main ones. Now, the biggest advantage of the classical is that it allows you to play a number of structures, but it's fairly easy to learn. It's fairly easy to understand. The moves are rather intuitive as far as Sicilians are concerned, and it's fundamentally sound. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the classical. I perhaps am a little bit biased toward it because I grew up playing it a lot. Excuse me, I need a drink. But I think that the classical is a very good introductory opening system into the Sicilian. It's quite theoretical, but once again, even if you forget theory, it's not so difficult to figure out the bits and bobs that will make your position quite sensible. Yeah, it's definitely one of the best ones out there, and I would definitely put this very high up on our list. I'm thinking if there is anything else I need to add. But no, I think that's it. So, classical, got tier. No questions. No questions whatsoever. Alright, back into funky shenanigans. Our next variation is going to be the Nimzowitch Sicilian, which is knight f6. Now, this is perhaps the biggest oddball in the entire tier list, because this doesn't even look like a proper Sicilian, especially after e5, knight d5, knight c3, which is one of the biggest main lines in the Nimzowitch. The whole Nimzowitch variation is based on a very, very tricky and complex line that goes e6, knight d5, ed, d4, knight c6, dc, bishop c5, queen takes d5, and then queen b6. And now white can't defend f2, and crazy complex variations occur. The problem with this whole setup is that A, if white knows this line really well, then black is in trouble, and that's the main line of the Nimzowitch. And white has a myriad of sidelines that are perfectly fine and playable along the way, such as d4 here, and then retake with the queen is actually quite a good line. But even knight c3, e6, knight e4 is an annoying line. So overall, I would not recommend the Nimzowitch Sicilian, because if you want to learn the Sicilian, this is not one, in the sense that it's a really a total oddball where d4 is not really being played. The pawn structure looks nothing like a Sicilian. It is, however, the ultimate surprise weapon that you might want to throw in here and there. And so I am going to put this in the surprise weapon list, although just tricks would do as well. But out of respect, I'm going to put this down to the surprise weapons. Next, Scheveningen. The Scheveningen, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, by the way, it's a Dutch word named after a Dutch city. Scheveningen, something like that, I think is the correct Dutch pronunciation. Is the Sicilian that arises, doesn't matter if it's e6 or d6, because those two moves will basically be followed up by the other. It's this early e6, d6 story, very similar to the Najdorf but less flexible. And by less flexible, what I mean is that in the Najdorf, depending on how white responds after a6, a lot of the times black can choose to play e6 and go into Scheveningen structures, or black can play e5, which is unique to the Najdorf, right? Now, the other downside, if I can say so, about the Scheveningen is that it invites the Keres attack, which is a quite dangerous weapon, and you really need to know your stuff here, otherwise we can very easily get rolled over. If you do know your stuff, however, then it's totally fine. The greatest benefit of the Scheveningen is that, as you have already heard me, I have referred to it a lot in the previous evaluations or discussions of other openings that rely on the knowledge of this very line. And so knowing your Scheveningen setups, Scheveningen, whatever, sorry Dutchies, is definitely very helpful later on. Even if you want to drop it and learn something else, your knowledge of this is going to be super duper valuable. Would I recommend it as an introduction, or rather as a first Sicilian? I definitely would not recommend it, so I don't necessarily think it's a bad choice to start with at all. I'm gonna put it in champion, but I'm going to leave it there. Next up, we have the Kupreichik. The Kupreichik variation is exactly what we have on the board, and in this position, instead of a6 Najdorf, knight c6 classical, e6 Scheveningen, g6 dragon, it's bishop d7, which is a big fat none of the above, show me what you want to do, and then I'm going to adjust my plans accordingly type of move. It is a move that is trying to be flexible. It's a very rarely played variation, and it fundamentally relies on black understanding the classical, the Scheveningen, the dragon, because occasionally black plays g6 as well, and trying to figure out the best response against each white move there is. Objectively speaking, not a great line. It's not losing either. Definitely a big red flag as far as first introductory line into Sicilian, because once again, you really need to understand subtleties of the Sicilian to play this confidently. So I would call this a surprise weapon, and that's how I would treat it, and I would definitely not recommend this as your first line into the Sicilian. On to the pin. The pin variation is a fascinating line that is very, very popular on club level, which is knight f6, knight c3, and bishop b4. Now, with modern engines now available, this line is bordering on the unplayable. Because of e5, knight e4 is virtually losing, and after knight d5, both the queen g4 and the bishop d2 variations are very clearly advantageous to white. And so there's very little else to say about it, because bishop b4 virtually forces white to play e5 here. And once again, these variations are really not that great for black, at all, if white knows theory. And that's not how you want to play the Sicilian, that you are, saying your Hail Marys that your opponent forgot to check on this line. There are tricks and traps and whatnots, but in the end of the day, it is a no on every possible level as far as I'm concerned. No for beginners, no for playing it. So this is gonna go to the just tricks. The four knights. Now, the four knights is a funny business. The four knights is basically knight f3, knight c6 or e6, it doesn't matter, d4, take, knight f6, knight c3, and e6. So what's cooking here is that white's best move is knight b d5. And here, black has basically three maybe, but mostly two acceptable moves, d6, which transposes into the Sveshnikov. And so we are not discussing that. And the other one is bishop b4, which more or less forcingly leads to there's an insanely complex line with bishop f4 or a3, bishop takes, knight takes d5, which leads to this IQP structure, which is utterly dull. It really is very, very boring, but super easy to play for black. Very free piece play, no problems with development, king safety, and the games tend to have a very drawish tendency. If white is not very stupid, it's very difficult to lose this for white. But it's also very difficult to win, right? So what's very interesting about the four knights is that there is an extreme contrast between the two lines that black takes on. So after bishop b4, a3, bishop takes, knight takes d5 is positional, it's dry, it's ultimately not fun, but it is at the same time a position that is very easy to mishandle, so it's beginner friendly in a way, right? Whereas bishop f4 invites the most insane complications like knight d4, queen f3 I think is the line, d5, knight c7, check, and the entire board is on fire. Absolutely, I think it's actually castles, irrational, and then g5, I think it is. Or bishop takes, b takes, e5 now as I'm looking up at the database. Total, absolute mayhem. You need to be a tactical wizard. Or you need to know theory like your life depended on it, because it does. So because of this contrasting effect, I don't really consider this to be a good introduction into Sicilians, because of that conflict. That being said, by the way, Selecki has a brilliant course on it, to just contradict me right there. But you know, like, I would be feeling a little bit weird if I learned it first and then half of the time I'm playing an utterly boring IQP and the other half of times the board is on literal fire and it's like, wow, crazy mayhem. Objectively speaking, it's a very solid line, right? So it definitely deserves to be up here. That's for sure. I don't know how beginner friendly it is. It's beginner friendly in the sense that there are not a lot of different approaches that white can take, right? So it's either that a3 or that bishop f4 lines. And so it's quite narrow in terms of theory. And that is a big appeal, perhaps, for many beginners. I'm a bit of a fence-sitter about this. I'm going to put it in champion tier. The next one is the Paulsen Basman. I don't even know what that is. What is the Paulsen Basman? Chess coach Google's name of opening. That's epic. What is the Paulsen Basman? Oh, okay. All right. You leave you alone. Apparently the Paulsen Basman is c5, knight f3, e6, d4, takes, and bishop c5. Actually, a much better way to present it is the queen b6 line early on, which is almost always followed up by bishop c5, except against knight b3. I used to play this, by the way, which is quite hilarious that I didn't know it was called the Paulsen Basman line, but here we go. It's a very, very shady story, guys. It's a line that, yeah, very often transposes into various kinds of neo-Paulsens, but not necessarily in a good way. The biggest problem, however, with it is that the primary idea is not good. And the primary idea is to play queen b6 here. And white has got multiple very, very good responses. The main one being knight a4, queen a5, pawn c3, bishop takes d4, queen d4, e5, queen d1. I think this is a line. It's a very specific variation. You only need to know this one very line as soon as white plays knight c3 and not the early knight b3 ideas. But it's definitely inferior. Like, no matter how well you know this, you are going to have a slightly worse position. And by the way, I think queen b4 is a potential move here. And my very cruel engine friend tells me that queen d4... Oh, wait, I got confused. Isn't it knight first? Yeah, it is knight f6, my bad. Yeah, this is actually sensational, by the way. Hello. Good luck defending this. Yeah, anyway, so it's actually, sorry, knight f6, knight c5. I did have a few games like this. And then castles. Yeah, Something like this. Anyway, long story short, narrow theory, but all of them are pretty miserable for black. Do not recommend. It is kind of okay as an occasional weapon. So I'm gonna put it in the surprise weapon category, but it's definitely a line that I would not want to write home about. Now, the King of Sicilians on the menu next, and that is going to be the Najdorf. Nothing, absolutely nothing I can say about the Najdorf on the negative side of things, apart from the fact that it is a bucket load of theory. That being said, if you learn the Najdorf, you almost by default learn every single Sicilian structure there is, except for the occasional hedgehog. Like, there's no way. Like, white never gets hedgehogs out of the Najdorf, because this is how we start. But you will know an awful lot about the Scheveningen structures and the Najdorf structures. This is basically the crown jewel of the Sicilians. It has stepped up to that role as a result of Fischer's impeccable and immense analytical work, and that was then double, triple, hundredfold done by Kasparov, who was then another huge champion of this variation. Once again, the only thing I can say about on the negative side about the Najdorf is that it's a fair bit of theory. That being said, once you start playing it, you will find that the vast majority of moves are very intuitive, at least in the first 10 moves. Like almost against everything, if you play, let's say, e5, right? You're going to put a bishop here, you're going to put a bishop here, knight d7, castles, and you have done already what most openings require you to do, which is to develop all your pieces and castle your king, right? And likewise in most main lines, bishop comes here, we tend to develop the long diagonal bishop here, and then we also tend to put a knight here. So this is also an extremely frequently played scenario. Of course, immense, crazy tactical variations pretty much everywhere, but hello, this is Sicilian, so that's what we want. Long story short, absolute god tier. God tier Sicilian, no questions asked whatsoever. In fact, I'm even gonna swap it. No, I cannot apparently. Yes, I can. Najdorf is first and foremost. Okay, Katalimov, never knew that it was what it was called, but it says b6 in the image, so I am assuming that we are talking about... Oh, actually, we are going to talk about b6 right away. Sorry, b6. b6, d4, takes. In my opinion, it is just a huge no-go. At the best of times, you are going to basically find yourself in an inferior Scheveningen, if you manage to do that, because in the Scheveningen you go a6, b5, but we already committed to b6. So one of the key counterplay ideas in many Sicilians, a6, b5, b4, has already been removed. Forget about it. It doesn't exist. Finally, I found a reason to justify the existence of trash. Now, the hedgehog is a very interesting proposition as far as Sicilian is concerned, because there is no hedgehog. In terms of you cannot choose to play the hedgehog. What you can do is that you can choose to play the Paulsen and hope, or I don't know if you want it or not, it depends, that they play into the hedgehog. And there is also a line in the Taimanov, which looks very hedgehoggy when they play knight b5 here, d6, c4, and then we have Maroczy bind versus hedgehog. Now the hedgehog as a structure is a must-know as far as I'm concerned. It's really fun. It occurs in a lot of openings. Engaging with is really cool, but it made absolutely no sense to put it on this tier list, because once again, you cannot... There is no hedgehog line in the Sicilian. There are variations, or I should rather say sub-variations in the Paulsen, in the Kan. I can't think of any other where it can occur that can lead to the hedgehog. That being said, it's a very important thing to know, so I'm going to chuck it up there. Now, let's deal with all the dragons. The dragon is a very unique, oopsie, that's not where we want it to go, is a very unique variation of the Sicilian, in that it is a completely different family of structures, plans, ideas from all the other Sicilians, all of them, right? In that we develop the bishop to g7, to the long diagonal. This is completely unique to the dragon, the accelerated dragon, and the hyperpolar accelerated dragon. There are some Scheveningen lines where move 15 to 20, after we castled, we play rook e8, and then the bishop gets rerouted here, not even remotely close. So this is a completely different concept, idea, opening on its own right, and it's a tremendous amount of fun. Absolutely awesome. Its reputation with the engines is a bit up and down. Kasparov defended it with incredible success against Anand in their World Championship match. Magnus played it every now and then. Anish Giri made a chessable course about it, which seems to suggest that black is in no trouble whatsoever. And it is an opening that actually how do I put it? The lower your playing strength, let's assume we are going down from Super GM to club level, the more fun it becomes. Because the less impressively white plays, the more fun you get to do with black. It is very aggressive. It is very theoretical. But on that note, even if you do not know too much theory, but you are shown the key ideas, the key concepts, the main attacking patterns, in particular in the Yugoslav, if you are introduced into the concept of exchange sack like your life depended on it every single time you can, and also to dodge the bishop trades, and then a couple of mating pattern attacks with h4, h5, once you are introduced to all of these, you almost feel like at least semi-competent in the dragon. So it is a very fun line, it's very dynamic. Downside to it is that it has immense theory, but on that note I would like to say that you can play it reasonably confidently after a few 10 hours of learning and understanding what's going on. And I actually wouldn't mind recommending this to people as a first Sicilian. It's not going to help you an awful lot to understand the remaining Sicilian families, but you will be an expert of this one. And if it works for you, you don't need to learn any other. Now, the accelerated dragon is an altogether different kettle of fish. So the accelerated dragon is called accelerated because black opts to hold the d-pawn back. And in many variations, not against the Marozzi bind, black ends up playing d5 in one go. I think d5 is a move already here. Is it? And then a5, or maybe a5 first and then d5. Yeah, it is actually a move here. Hence the name Accelerated Dragon. It's a lot of fun too, especially against these bishop c4 lines, because here black can benefit greatly from having not played d6 earlier on. The downside to it, which is very debatable whether it's down or upside, is that we need to know really, really well the Marozzi bind, which is the most thematic response and the most ambitious response against the accelerated dragon as well. Now, when I say downside depends on how you look at it, it's because, of course, if you are happy to take this on, it means that you are going to become an expert of yet another pawn structure. The contrast here, though, is that a little bit like the Okeli, that in order to play the Marozzi bind really well, you have to have impeccable positional understanding. Fantastic, very subtle, deep positional plans, and you need to kind of weather the storm for the first 20, 25, 30 moves when the space disadvantage can be at times rather depressing. On the other hand, the bishop c4 lines, when white insists on playing something akin to the Yugoslav, are very, very dynamic, tactical, and sharp. Again, it can be a good thing, but I feel like it's a little bit conflicting. Long story short, I don't think that I would like beginners to start with this, But objectively speaking, the Accelerated Dragon is a very, very solid choice. I'm gonna put it to champion for the time being. I think it's going to stay there. Very little is going to be said about the Hyper Accelerated Dragon, which is G6 first. It is subtleties that are outside of the scope of the open Sicilian why one would pick this over knight c6, which is to avoid the Rossolimo. But it invites c3, so you gain some, you lose some. In the end of the day, almost certainly we are going to end up in the same. And so I've never quite understood the appeal of it. If you really hate playing against the Rossolimo Sicilian, do it. Any other case, whatever, essentially it's gonna be an Accelerated Dragon. Okay, now we have got a few interesting ones. Kveinis. Dr. Google coming to the rescue again. Ah, it's the Queen B6, which is actually the Grivas variation, so that's why I didn't know it. Right. This is something that I used to play an awful lot in my youth. The Grivas variation, I have no idea why it's known as the Kveinis. It is basically a really weird way to get into Scheveningen structures, which usually end up like this. Or, if white is a little bit more ambitious, then often immediate queen e2, bishop out, castle, queenside ideas occur. It's a sidekick of the classical and the Scheveningen together. If you have very good knowledge of Scheveningen setups, Scheveningen, and classical Sicilian setups, then I recommend you to occasionally throw this in as a side weapon. That's the best case scenario. So, yeah, it's a bit of a sideline that requires you to know a lot of structures, but in most cases it's a slightly inferior version of those structures, such as the Scheveningen and so on. And so surprise weapon at the best of times. And the embarrassment continues as I also need to Google the Godiva variation. I'm sure that I know this too. Oh, that's the same. That's also Queen B6, so that goes here. The Dragadorf. No, down here. The Dragadorf is a very cute name of an opening setup, which is a combination of, you will not believe it, the dragon and the Najdorf. So what is cooking here? The idea of the Dragadorf is that black is hoping to combine the best of both worlds into one opening system, the Najdorf and the dragon. So we are going to have a dragon bishop, but we are also going to play an early b5 to float the threat of b4. The problem is that usually when you want to combine two openings with the intention of wanting the best of both worlds, you end up having neither. And that is the case here too. Move orders are very, very important here. Otherwise, you tend to get run over incredibly quickly. The other problem with this system is that the general attacking ideas that work really well for white in the dragon tend to be quite sufficient against the Dragadorf too, like the g4, h4, h5 ideas, which is why very often in positions like these, black needs to throw in an extra h5 as well. And that is already really and truly asking way too much from the position. If you really know what's cooking in this line, you can be quite successful with it. It requires immense knowledge of the Najdorf and the dragon, and then this line in particular. But in the end of the day, even if you know your stuff really, really well, if white knows their stuff too, you will find yourself in a difficult spot. Best case scenario, it's a good surprise weapon, and that's about it. And last but not least, ladies and gents, we are going to do a quick one with the Sveshnikov. The Sveshnikov is, in a way, in my opinion, one of the most aggressive open Sicilians. In fact, the most aggressive, perhaps level with the Kalashnikov. And the consideration here is that in the mainline Sveshnikovs, no matter what variation white chooses, white never gets to attack the black king. It almost always is the reverse. That black is the one who has the dynamic counterplay, and usually it is targeted against the white king, whereas white thrives on playing against structural weaknesses. So for example, let's have a look at the main, one of the biggest main lines. So as you can see, although it may look at first sight, oh, that's not good, f4 first, it may look like white is attacking, but all of these moves are actually played to hold back black's initiative, which is based on an f5 break, and also removing the knight from d5 and then break with d5 or f5, and it's a kingside push like mad. But likewise in the more positional line where white plays knight d5 here too black tends to play for very, very strong kingside play with king h8 and later on f5. So white is trying to do something against the pawns, and black is going to play for an f5 break, open up the f-file, and try to drum up some play on the king side. The Sveshnikov is fundamentally sound. It requires the understanding of dynamic and positional chess both. The only downside to the Sveshnikov I can think of is that it's a bit narrow in terms of structures that occur. So it's either white trying to exploit the weakness of the d5 square, so it's this structure, or white lands a pawn on d5, and then it's this 4 on 3 versus the 4 on 3 on the other end. However, as far as soundness is concerned, it's one of the most reliable openings out there, period, and especially amongst the Sicilian lines. In fact, the big resurge and popularity of the Rossolimo Sicilian that kicked off basically late 1990s, early 2000s was fundamentally due to the fact that most professional elite top GMs couldn't find a line in the Sicilian Sveshnikov where they could realistically play for a win. So it's rock solid, it's fundamentally sound, it is fun, it can be very positional, it can be very aggressive. It is an ultimate awesome Sicilian variation. Up you go, baby. Sveshnikov number 3 on the God tier list. I pulled the Kalashnikov down to the champion category, mostly because the Kalashnikov tends to rely on the same structures, the same ideas, f5 breaks, and so on. However, unlike the Sveshnikov, it does allow the most thematic c4 response. Once again, the Maroczy bind setups, and here black is definitely exposed to some kind of positional tortures. Objectively speaking, this is quite good. G6 has become a very popular line lately because of the engine influence. Earlier, every man and his dog played here a6, bishop e6, bishop e7. Sveshnikov-like structures, but with the 2 pawns here and here suffocating black. Fundamentally sound, a lot of fun, especially against the knight c3 lines where black actually can play differently from the Sveshnikov, omitting knight f6 and playing other moves like b5, the knight goes to e7 instead, allowing earlier breaks and so on. There is a lot of firepower, a lot of fun. Some very famous games, notably Anand Rajabov and Nataf come to mind, where black just steamrolled white with beautiful attacks. But because of this c4 line that kind of strangles black's play, I will put the Kalashnikov down here to champion variation. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I have opened Pandora's box. Now everyone is going to jump at me, but so be it. It was a bit of a discussion starter too. I'm curious what you guys think. This is now the final version of my Sicilian tier list. Luckily the cut is perfect, you get to see everything. I hope that it has helped a little bit, in case you were wondering about what you should or what you perhaps shouldn't play. Please note that there are myriads of chessable courses on almost all of these, and I did not mean to hurt or offend or you know, go against anyone's work. On the contrary, I think that chessable courses, even on some of the lines that I put down to Shady, are actually really good in the sense that their authors tried the very best to make those lines playable, fun, engaging, and so on. So once again, it's definitely, I'm trying to stay as neutral as I can in this regard, but I had to express my opinion, and that is on the screen. If you lasted this long, folks, please don't forget to sub, to like, to super thank me if you can, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.